Napoleon left Moscow with the aim of rejoining the 37,000 men of IX Corps at Smolensk, using the supplies and arsenals there, and thus appearing to good advantage at the end of the hitherto disastrous Russian campaign. He made yet another of a catalogue of mistakes in 1812 by failing to order his men to travel light and fast. Weekly he allowed them to take their immense hoards of booty with them, arguing that they needed proofs of their victory in the campaign. The result was a tatterdemalion marching column well described by Louis-Philippe de Segur, an eyewitness. It looked like a caravan, a wandering nation, or rather, like one of those armies of antiquity returning with slaves and spoil after a great devastation. The army marched in wide parallel columns towards Kaluga. Not even the regimental commanders were told the true destination of the once proud Grand Army. The seeds of a disaster were all there in the form of insufficient food and inadequate winter clothing. There was horse fodder for less than a week. As the man appointed governor of Moscow during the 35-day sojourn, it fell to Mortier and 8,000 of the young guard to remain behind in Moscow to set fuses, blow up the Kremlin and gut the city. Mortier, angry that 1 in 7 of the guard had succumbed on the march to Moscow through heat, starvation, fatigue and desertion, disobeyed his orders and spent the time trying to collect supplies for the perilous homeward march. It was not until the 23rd of October that he finally quit Moscow. It was lucky for him, and the Grand Army in general, that Kutuzov's military intelligence was so poor that he did not learn of the French retreat until the 22nd. Napoleon had originally intended to strike south and west across country unravaged by war, and therefore plentiful in supplies. Because of a signal failure of nerve, he instead directed his army on the 26th of October to follow the outward route, the post road leading northwest to Smolensk, terrain which had been devastated first by the Russian scorched earth policy, and then by the advancing French army. A crow flying over this barren area would have needed to carry its own provisions. The decision to divert from the southwesterly route meant that the destruction of the French army became inevitable, so it led Napoleon to yet another error of judgment, and this one the worst yet. Moving swiftly in pursuit of the encumbered Grand Army, Kutuzov caught up with it at the river crossing at Maloyaroslavets on the 23rd of October. Next day a ferocious battle for the town took place, during which it changed hands 7 times before the Italian corps under General Pino rose to the occasion and drove the Russians out. Both sides withdrew, prior, so it seemed, to a second Borodino. But then both commanders dithered. Kutuzov was shaken by the stirring performance of the Italians and broke off contact to lick his wounds. Napoleon's scouts reported Kutuzov's army well dug in, too strong to attack. The emperor was downcast and indecisive. He told Caulaincourt mournfully, "I always beat the Russians, but it never seems to solve anything." He nearly had even more serious reason for depression. At 4 a.m. a Cossack patrol came within an ace of capturing him. It turned out that the old guard had unaccountably failed to place pickets. Convinced that his famous luck had deserted him, Napoleon sought sanctuary in the known, however terrible, rather than in the unknown on the southwestern route. Never had his gambler's instinct more obviously failed him. He did not even send out scouts on the Kaluga road, for had he done so he would have discovered it was clear and unopposed. Instead he called a council on the 25th of October, attended by Eugene, Murat, Devout, Bessières and Berthier, at which the reluctant decision was taken to follow the devastated road to Smolensk through Borovsk, Majeivsk, Gzhatsk and Vyazma. The emperor half-heartedly suggested a return to Moscow, but this was shouted down. Murat boldly opted to continue via Kaluga even if it meant risking another battle, but the other marshals fell in eagerly with the idea that a northwesterly retreat might drop Kutuzov astern, especially as he seemed to be retiring southwards. When Bessières ventured to use the taboo word retreat, no one demurred. Napoleon's panic, "No other word will do," after the bruising encounter at Maloyaroslavets shows he was no longer the great captain he once was. The young Bonaparte would have seen the importance of Maloyaroslavets and secured it long before the Russians got there. Besides, the decision taken on the 25th of October evinces the utmost mental confusion. Once the possibility of retreating from Moscow loomed, the emperor should have bent all his energies to gathering adequate supplies for the army. Moreover, if, as he claimed, his purpose in taking the southwesterly route was to sweep Kutuzov from his path, why did he shirk the challenge when it came? If the fear of further casualties deterred him, why had not similar considerations ruled out the march on Moscow after Borodino? As it was, the Battle of Maloyaroslavets followed by the diversion en route to the outward itinerary meant that a week had been lost for no good reason. This lost week was to be crucial later on. Having handed Kutuzov a great strategic victory on a plate, Napoleon managed to coax his army to complete the 50 miles from Maloyaroslavets to Majeivsk in 2 days. Next day they marched through the village of Borodino, skirting the battlefield. Psychologically, this had a disastrous effect on morale. Although the men tried to shield their eyes, they could not avoid the sight of the 30,000 corpses on which wolves had fed, the immense tomb-like open grave into which bodies had been shoveled, the wheeling of carrion crows in the sky, or the stench of myriad rotting corpses. At 2 a.m. on the 30th of October, Napoleon asked Caulaincourt for a prognosis. He replied that things could only get worse, the weather would grow colder and the Russians stronger. The self-deceiving emperor argued lamely that the superior native intelligence of the French would allow them to prevail. Kutuzov's failure to move in with his vastly superior numbers and finish off the French has forever puzzled military historians. Kutuzov has his claque of admirers who see him as a brilliant Fabius to Bonaparte's Hannibal, but there has always been a revisionist point of view that sees him as bumbling and inept, slow and ponderous by nature rather than design. The most interesting suggestion is that Kutuzov believed the destruction of the Grand Army would ultimately benefit England more than Russia, and so, as an Anglophobe who suspected the British of being an ungrateful, unreliable and treacherous ally, he refrained from delivering the coup de grace. Those who champion Kutuzov sometimes advance the unlikely suggestion that he was so keen to avoid casualties among his own men that he preferred to allow starvation, panic, demoralization and general winter to do his job for him. The most sinister interpretation is that Kutuzov did not want to take prisoners, so he allowed the peasant guerrillas to exact their own grisly revenge. It is significant that he remained insouciant when Lauriston complained to him about atrocities by the partisans. Russian cynicism has since been rewritten in the form of a myth about a people's war, supposedly analogous to that visited on the Germans by Tito's partisans in 1942–44. Nothing could be less historically sound. Class antagonism in early 19th century Russia was so acute that the nobility would have been terrified of a genuine people's war, since they would, rightly, identify themselves as next in the line of fire after the French. The thing that most terrified the oligarchy of Moscow and St. Petersburg and Rate R2 was the possibility that Napoleon might free the serfs, as they themselves urged him to. So fearful was the Russian elite of the peasantry that it armed most of the rural militias with useless pikes. Near Moscow, peasants who took up arms against French foragers were actually arrested as mutineers. The fear was well grounded. In December 1812 there were serious riots among Russian militia regiments raised in the province of Penza. It cannot be stressed enough that the Russian peasants did not fight out of patriotic fervor, but for loot, for self-defense and, most of all, for revenge. Napoleon could not have selected a worse itinerary, for the fury of the peasants on this route was incandescent. This was the third time in as many months they had been looted and despoiled by marauding armies. It was noteworthy that when they had a choice, the peasants kept out of the war and refrained from scorched earth policies, for, after all, what did that mean but the destruction of their own flocks and produce without compensation? People's war is a pure myth. The burned crops and poisoned wells were the work of the Cossacks and the army. When the French penetrated areas where the Russian army had never been, everything was intact and supplies were plentiful. It is quite clear that the dreadful atrocities visited on French prisoners, stragglers or the wounded were the expression of a terrible displaced homicidal fury towards the Russian nobility. The peasants were doing with impunity to an invader what, but for fear of death, they would have done to their own masters. Displaced fury and rage projected onto their own kind goes far to explain the frightful tradition of cruelty in Russian peasant life. The peasants thought nothing of stripping adulterous wives naked and beating them half to death or tying them to the end of a wagon and dragging them naked through a village, or castrating horse thieves, branding housebreakers with hot irons or hacking other petty criminals to death with sickles. Gogol later spoke of the exceptional cruelty of the Russian people, and the peasantry in particular. Partly it was a function of a culture in which life was held cheap, partly a reflex action to a harsh environment, but mostly it was an internalization of the brutality to which the peasants had been subjected by their betters. But if the Russian nobility had sowed the wind, it was the luckless French army in R812 that reaped the whirlwind. The fortunate ones taken by the partisans would suffer a quick if agonizing death, being impaled on stakes or thrown alive into vats of boiling water. For the less fortunate, more hideous ends lay in store. The peasants would offer large sums to the Cossacks to be able to take over their prisoners. Then they would subject them to stomach-turning tortures. Eyes were pulled out, nails hammered into the body, legs and arms cut off to leave a bleeding torso, stakes driven down the throat. One of two particularly favored methods was to wrap a naked victim in a wet sack with a pillow tied around the torso. Villagers would then vie with one another to beat the stomach with hammers, logs and stones, so that the internal organs were crushed but no marks were left. Another was to raise the victim on a pulley with hands and feet tied together. He would then be dropped so that the vertebrae in his back were broken. The process was continued until the prisoner was reduced to a spineless sack. News of the fate that awaited them if captured ran through the ranks of the Grand Army, causing terror. Such was the soldiers' fear of the partisans that they would attempt suicide if taken prisoner, and the more humane Russian officers simply shot their captives out of hand to spare them the insane attentions of the peasants. Lest it be thought that stories of Russian atrocities lost nothing in the telling, it is worth citing 3 instances recorded by Sir Robert Wilson, a British observer with the Russian army. After subjecting their prisoners to horrible tortures, the partisans first burnt a group of some 50 French troops alive. A second group of the same number was buried alive, while for the third group, about 60 strong, a kind of death by peasant bacchanalia was prepared. The prisoners were stripped naked, then spread-eagled across a large felled tree with their necks protruding as if on the executioner's block. Peasant men and women then hopped about singing in chorus while they beat out the prisoners' brains with hoes and cudgels. That large numbers of wounded were rounded up to share this gruesome fate was largely the fault of the callous French wagoners. When carts jolted over rutted tracks, the wounded would naturally scream in agony. Exasperated by this, the drivers liked to crack the whip to accelerate, thus bouncing off their ululating charges. The lucky ones were run over by the carts following behind, and the unlucky ones left for wolves to devour or the partisans to execute in their frightful way. Sir Robert Wilson conveyed some of the flavor of the French panic-stricken retreat in a famous description: the naked masses of dead and dying men, the mangled carcasses of I0 horses which had in some cases been cut for food before life had ceased, the craving of famine at other points forming groups of cannibals, the air enveloped in flame and smoke, the prayers of hundreds of naked ret flying from the peasantry, whose shouts of vengeance echoed incessantly through the woods, the wrecks of cannon, powder wagons, all stores of every description. It formed such a scene as probably was never witnessed in the history of the world. Wilson makes the important point that, even without the presence of the murderous partisans, the Grand Army would have been in grave trouble from lack of equipment and horses. Soon the French discarded uniforms in favor of anything that gave a little warmth, be it stolen or looted merchants' winter coats, women's furs, and even Chinese or Tartar apparel. The very appearance of the army worked against its morale, as it looked like a gigantic troupe of itinerant mountebanks or some Dantean version of a traveling circus. Meanwhile the horses, which had died in tens of thousands on the outward march, succumbed in even larger numbers on the retreat. In the early days, on an inadequate diet of pine and willow bark, they were too exhausted to pull the artillery out of the mud, and, when the snow and ice came, they could not walk at all. Not having been fitted with winter shoes, they simply slithered helplessly on the snow and ice. Miraculously, almost until the end the French were still somehow able to mount cavalry charges, but mostly the horses simply dropped in their tracks. For hundreds of miles the Grand Army lived mainly on horseflesh. Napoleon's once proud host was on the verge of extinction even before it reached Smolensk. They had run out of provisions and there were no more to be had in the desolate and ravaged countryside. Mortier, who had hitherto survived with the young guard in the rear on an exclusive diet of brandy and biscuits, found himself by the 8th of November reduced to eating horse's liver washed down with snow. More and more men abandoned their booty, and then their weapons. When Napoleon reached Vyazma, there was already a so-mile column straggling behind him, with the rearguard looking like a rabble of refugees, with masses of starving camp followers strung out behind it. As the army approached Smolensk, attacks intensified. On the 3rd of November I Corps was cut off near Fyodoroivsky, and only narrowly rescued by the intervention of IV Corps. And now what Napoleon had most dreaded finally came to pass, the intervention of General Winter. The first snow flurries fell on the 5th of November and by the 7th of November it was snowing heavily. Napoleon reached Smolensk on the 9th of November to find that all his hopes of wintering in a secure base in the city were vain. No less than 4 items of depressing intelligence rained in on him and made him aware that he would have to retreat immediately all the way back to the Niemen. First, the city governor, General Charpentier, informed him that the stocks of food were not at the expected high levels, since Victor's and Oudinot's corps had taken most of it when they headed north. Secondly, his spies reported that the Russians were maneuvering to cut off his escape, while Kutuzov dogged his steps, moving parallel to the French column a little to the south. Wittgenstein was heading for the Berezina to seize the bridges there, while on the other flank Tshitsagov threatened the great French supply dump at Minsk. Thirdly, word came of an attempted coup in Paris by General Mallet. Finally, as the most pressing immediate problem, it was clear that French morale had collapsed completely. An entire division of reinforcements under General Barégui de Hilliers surrendered lamely to an inferior force southwest of Smolensk. Napoleon remained in Smolensk for 3 days, trying vainly to instill order into chaos. As more and more intelligence reached him, it must have seemed to the emperor that all the powers of heaven were conspiring against him. MacDonald, it transpired, had abandoned the siege of Riga and was currently lolling in inactivity, while Schwarzenberger's corps to the south were also out of the picture. And by the time the rearguard entered Smolensk, there was no food for them. In a ruthless application of first come, first served, the vanguard ate up all the food stocks, gorging themselves with no thought of their fellow soldiers toiling in the rear. At first quartermasters asked for chits and ration books, but the hungry men brushed them aside, took what they wanted, broke into the reserve warehouses and consumed everything there too. Unable to control this rabble, Napoleon vented his fury on the governor, Charpentier, who explained meekly that he had had no power to countermand the orders of Oudinot and Victor, his superior in rank. The emperor was reduced to watching helplessly while his men enjoyed the crudest form of rest and recreation, huddling in improvised camps amid the rubble of the city they had destroyed 3 months earlier. The infuriated rearguard, finding all the food gone, sacked and looted whatever they could find in mindless acts of desperation. Cannibalism became rampant as men ate the charred flesh of fallen comrades. On the 12th of November, Napoleon and the vanguard moved out of Smolensk, now seriously concerned that the Dnieper crossing at Orsha and the Berezina crossing at Orshov might already be in enemy hands. His army was now a barely credible fighting force. A muster at Smolensk revealed that numbers were down to 41,000, as against the 96,000 present at Maloyaroslavets and the 6 seconds, 0 left at Vyazma. Even so, the survivors did not form a compact force but were still strung out. It was not until the 17th that Ney and the rearguard got clear of Smolensk. Leaving Smolensk on icy roads, the Grand Army literally slid and slithered the first 15 miles, which they covered in 22 hours. By now it was snowing heavily, visibility was severely limited in thick blizzards, the breath of the exhausted soldiers froze on their beards, the heavy weight of the snow on their boots made every step an ordeal. Some sank into crevices formed by sunken lanes or excavated earth, and never rose again. With temperatures ranging from a high of -20°F to a low of -30°, frostbite was common. Napoleon forced the pace, ordering 14 hours marching a day, much of it in darkness since by now there was daylight only between the hours of 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. There was no shelter and little rest, and their clothes, sodden with snow, froze on their bodies. The nights were if anything even worse. In the first place, it was hard to light fires from frozen pine branches, and when the fires were lit, places nearest the flames were sold to the highest bidder. Too far from the fire, and you risked freezing to death or being picked off by the lupine partisans who were attracted to the beacons of light. Too near, and you were in danger, when returning to the cold, of suffering gangrene on the extremities. Food and drink could scarcely be had at any price. Many men were killed when they swallowed snow to quench their thirst. Steaks were cut from the haunches of horses on the hoof, numbed by the cold. The animals felt no pain and their wounds would congeal in 16 degrees of frost, but they would die later from septicemia. At dawn, a line of ragged, bedraggled and increasingly shoeless men began dragging themselves through the snow, leaving behind a deserted camp village of corpses, cannons and wagons. Many companies who managed to sleep in comfort around a roaring fire after dining on horseflesh lost the will to march on in the morning, and were still apathetically sitting by their fires when the Cossacks or partisans caught up with them. The languishing army struggled on until the 17th of November when Kutuzov unexpectedly launched an attack. 6 miles east of Krasny, a force of 20,000 Russians under Miloradovich cut the road between Napoleon's vanguard and Eugene de Beauharnais' corps. Eugene resisted stubbornly and sent to the emperor for reinforcements. Napoleon sent back Mortier and the Young Guard, whom after Smolensk he had switched to the van. The Young Guard acquitted themselves brilliantly and forced the Russians to break off the action. But if Eugene was now safe, Devout was not. Napoleon was finally forced to send his 6,000 immortals of the Old Guard into action. The Guard proved as good as their reputation and routed the Russians in short order. The Russian Colonel Davidov reported that the Guard scythed through the Cossacks like a 100-gun warship through fishing boats. Napoleon now thought his rearguard was safe and was dumbfounded when the rescued Devout came to report that he had lost contact with Ney. Instead of leaving Smolensk together, Ney and Devout's corps had unaccountably left on separate days. Though the explanation was yet another mix-up in the imperial orders, Napoleon chose to fasten the blame on him for what seemed to be Ney's certain annihilation. It says much for Devout's moral fiber that he did not lose confidence in the emperor from that moment. As for Devout himself, having alienated both Jerome and Murat on this campaign, he was lucky to have the influential figures of Duroc and Bessières still speaking up for him. Ney meanwhile experienced adventures that no historical novelist could cap. He left Smolensk with 6,000 men on the 17th, and made rapid progress towards Krasny on the 18th, only to find the defeated but still substantial forces of Miloradovich across the road that led to the rest of the Grand Army, and safety. Undaunted by the thought that Kutuzov had a total force of 80,000 somewhere ahead of him, Ney attacked and with just 3,000 effectives broke the Russians' first line. Driven back from the second line by artillery and the sheer weight of Russian numbers, he dug in at a ravine, expecting at any minute to be overwhelmed by Kutuzov's hordes. Kutuzov, however, had been badly shaken by the mauling encounter with the Old Guard, and hesitated to press home the attack. Dusk fell. Under cover of darkness, Ney found his way to the Dnieper where, incredibly, his men were able to island hop from one ice floe to another and so gain the far bank. But the cost was high since only Z0 men reached the far side of the Dnieper, another 3,000 troops and a further 4,000 stragglers and camp followers were abandoned. All next day, under heavy Cossack attack, Ney's men hugged the river and surrounding woodland while they covered the 45 miles to Orsha. By nightfall they were down to 1,500 men and had constantly to form square to fend off marauding Cossacks. At 9 p.m. Ney resumed the march and, gambling that Orsha was still in French hands, sent a courier ahead asking for help. The message was received by Eugene, who throughout the horrors had consistently enhanced his military reputation. He set out at the head of a rescuing force, and early next morning he and Ney embraced each other as heroes. At 5 a.m. on the 21st of November, to universal amazement and joy, Ney arrived to join the main army with just 900 survivors. Napoleon was overjoyed and dubbed Ney the bravest of the brave. He added further plaudits, "I would sooner have given 300 millions from my treasury than lose such a man," he said. Ney's totally unlooked-for arrival temporarily lifted morale, which had taken a battering at the Dnieper. The Grand Army reached Orsha to find the river bridges intact and a 2-day supply of food for 40,000. But there were two pieces of devastatingly bad news. First, Minsk, with its store of 2 million individual rations, had fallen to the Russians. Secondly, and more immediately threatening, it now seemed certain that Tshitsakov would beat them to the Berezina crossings at Borisov. "This is beginning to be very serious," Napoleon confided to Caulaincourt, before ordering the destruction of all surplus transport, an impedimenta preparatory to another grueling forced march. Beyond Orsha there was finally some relief for the beleaguered Grand Army. The local people here, though not friendly, were not Russian and did not go in for massacres and atrocities. The worst of the ordeal from fellow humans was over, and at first it looked as though the same might apply to the ordeal by element, for a thaw set in, so that the troops could sleep at night without fearing death. Ironically, the thaw also threatened the army with total destruction, for the change in weather had turned a hard frozen polar surface into a seething torrent. Normally in late November the river was frozen to a depth of several feet of ice, so that the army could have crossed the river anywhere with complete safety. The same was the case in November R812 until the last week of the month. Here was yet another fatal consequence of the emperor's many unreasonable urban delays. By the 22nd of November Napoleon already knew from his spies that Tshitsakov had destroyed the Berezina bridges. This meant that the French were now virtually surrounded, with Wittgenstein's 30,000 men and Tshitsakov with another 34,000 ahead of them and Kutuzov's 80,000 in their rear. With the bridges down and without bridging equipment of their own, the French seemed doomed as they had just 49,000 effectives and 40,000 militarily useless stragglers. Fearing the worst, Napoleon ordered all state papers and regimental tricolors burnt. What saved the emperor at this desperate juncture was a combination of Russian timidity and the most amazing good luck. Mindful of Borodino and Krasny, Kutuzov kept at a safe distance, some 30 miles away. Then Oudinot came in to report to Napoleon what sounded like a miracle. General Corbineau, approaching the Berezina from Vilna and the west, found an unmarked ford near Studienka village, which he had bribed a peasant to reveal to him. Corbineau crossed the river on the 23rd of November and reported that a traverse by the whole army was feasible. But how to build the bridges? At this point it transpired that a certain General Ebel had taken the forethought the emperor should have exercised. Against orders he had saved 2 field forges, 2 wagons of charcoal and 6 of sapper tools and bridging equipment. If there was timber near Studienka, where the crossing was unopposed, and if the emperor could distract the Russians on the far side who were guarding all the likely bridging places, a small miracle could yet be achieved. Now, for the first time during the Rate R2 campaign, Napoleon returned to something like his best form. The task of crossing an icy river in full spate in the face of enemy forces appealed to his imagination. He ordered a number of feints to distract the enemy. The principal one was attempted by Oudinot at Achlodi, some miles below Borisov, on the 25th of November. Tshitsakov took the bait and moved his forces southwards, leaving the Borisov-Studienka stretch of river unopposed. He then compounded his error by not destroying the causeway through the marshes on the other side which led from the west bank of the Berezina to Vilna. Napoleon ordered Ebel to take his engineering force, demolish the houses in Studienka to get their wood, and then build two 300-foot bridges over the Beresina, to be completed by the 26th. As soon as the first bridge was completed, Ney's and Oudinot's corps would cross and form up defensively on the far bank to deal with any counterthrust from Tchitsagov. The bulk of the army would cross while Devoutsai Corps and Victor's IX Corps held the eastern bridgehead. Finally they too would cross. It was noteworthy that there was no place in this plan for the 40,000 stragglers. There followed a samurai exploit by Ebel and his men, who worked all night in freezing water to put the trestles and planking in place. Oudinot at once got his men across to form the western defense. Later that afternoon a second, larger, bridge was completed, and the artillery rushed over to the far bank. So far there was no sign of the Russians, but 3 breaks were discovered in the bridges, which Ebel and his 400 heroes worked all night to put right. By early afternoon of the 27th the Guard and the Imperial staff were also safely across, but around 4 p.m. 3 trestles on the artillery bridge collapsed. Those still on the eastern bank panicked, and a mad rush to the one remaining bridge ensued. Order was restored with great difficulty, but by that time hundreds had been trampled to death or knocked into the river to drown. Ebel repaired the other bridge and then had to hack a path through corpses on the smaller bridge to get I Corps and the rearguard across. It was not until the 27th that the Russians realized what was happening and attacked on both sides of the bridge. All day Oudinot's and Victor's men fought valiantly and repelled attack after attack, so that the crossings went on without interruption until the afternoon's debacle with the large bridge. Only at dusk did the sounds of battle fade away. The exhausted Ebel told the non-combatant stragglers to cross to the western bank under cover of darkness, but apathy won the day. They remained obstinately huddled round small fires on the eastern bank. Ebel could do no more. He and his 400 engineers were the great heroes of Beresina. Hardly any of them survived, for those who did not perish of frostbite, exposure and hypothermia were swept downstream in the ferocious current or were scythed down by enemy fire while they were repairing the bridge. Thus far Napoleon could congratulate himself on a superb feat of ingenuity and courage, but the pendulum swung against him during the night of 27–28 of November when General Partenox's division of Victor's Corps lost its way in a heavy snowstorm and blundered into the Russian lines, where they had no choice but to surrender. This loss tore a gaping hole in Victor's thin defensive line in the rearguard. After an ominous lull, at about midday on the 28th the Russians on the east bank brought heavy guns to bear on the bridges, causing a panic-stricken repeat performance of the previous day. Once again terrified men fell to an icy death in the Beresina, as the artillery bridge collapsed a second time, brought down by a combination of Russian shells and the sheer weight of fleeing soldiers. Once again the rearguard performed prodigies of valor, and the astonishing accuracy of their artillery at last pushed the Russians back out of range. For the second day the rearguard fought unaided, for on the western bank French units were engaged this day in a grim du-ordi struggle. Oudinot and Ney covered themselves in laurels by personal bravery. Oudinot by his personal charisma and courage prevented a rout, while Ney inflicted 2,000 Russian casualties by leading a charge by Doumerc's cuirassiers. It was a second Krasny, like Kutuzov before him. Tchitsagov fell back in alarm at the ferocity of the French fight back. The last stage of a brilliant operation was completed when the rearguard finally crossed to the western bank at RAM on the 29th of November, but the stragglers still refused to follow them. Shell-shocked and demoralized, the camp followers seem in a very real sense to have been afraid of the dark. At any rate, they ignored warning after warning from Ebel that this was their last chance, since in the morning he would be detonating charges to prevent a pursuit by Kutuzov's contingents. At 9 next morning, as promised, Ebel blew up the bridges. Now at last, when it was too late, the non-combatants began to rush for the bridges, only to be consumed by an inferno. Some R0000 perished, some in the flames, but most of them in the river as the bridges sank under the waters of the Beresina. With a hiss like that of a gigantic ingot steeped in water by a blacksmith, the river was choked with corpses for a week. The 30,000 survivors who were left on the east bank were then cut to pieces by the Cossacks. It had cost Napoleon 25,000 casualties in fighting men and 25 guns plus the loss of the non-combatants to cross the Beresina. By any standards the net result was a disaster, but, playing up the miraculous aspects of the army's escape and the 20,000 or so casualties inflicted on the Russians, he issued a communiqué and claimed a victory. At last the survivors could rest secure from partisan attacks in close pursuit by the Russian army, but now the real enemy was General Winter. The R60 miles to Vilna saw the cruelest December on record. Wilson spoke of a subtle, razor-cutting, creeping wind that penetrated the skin, muscle, bone to the very marrow, rendering the skin as white, and the whole limb affected as fragile, as alabaster. A week later the Grand Army was down to zero effectives. Thousands more had simply fallen asleep and died in the snow. Napoleon expressed no concern for the suffering. doubtless reckoning that in the circumstances it was a waste of emotion. Despite notable instances of great selfishness, discipline in the ranks was actually better now that Kutuzov and the partisans had been dropped astern. Kutuzov largely abandoned the pursuit at the Berezina, simply sending large squadrons of Cossacks to harry the French. At Molochno, where the main road from Minsk to Vilna joined them, there was a very sharp skirmish between the rearguard and the Cossacks. Napoleon dismissed it as a bagatelle and spent the 3rd of December composing his 29th bulletin, a précis of the campaign, which admitted some part of the disaster but played up Borodino, Krasny, Berezina, Ney's wanderings after Smolsk and all other heroic exploits of the Grand Army. This was the Emperor's last contribution to the Rate R2 campaign for, at Smorgoni at Ro PM. On the 5th of December, he left the army, pleading the necessity of getting back to Paris with all speed. For appearing to abandon his army he has been much criticized and shades of Egypt in 1799 have been invoked. The comparison will not really hold, as indeed has been pointed out by those of his critics who allege that it was even more reprehensible to quit the army now than in 1799, for in that case he left shortly after a notable victory and in this he left after a disaster. On the other hand, what was left of his army was now almost safe, as it had not been in Egypt, and Napoleon in self-defense cited the accepted practice whereby a general was usually ordered home if his army was reduced to a single corps. He also feared that if he tarried in Poland, Austria and Prussia would declare war and bar his passage back to France. Most of all, though, his departure was dictated by pure raison d'etat. After the Mallet coup, it could only be a matter of time before there was another attempted putsch. The emperor could well arrive home to find he had been deposed in his absence. Accordingly, Napoleon made preparations for the swiftest possible 400-mile journey. Since they were still in hostile territory, it was decided that the best method was to travel incognito in 3 coaches. With him in his own coach were Caulaincourt, Duroc, Lobau, Fane the Grand Marshal, the Mameluke valet Roustam and a Polish interpreter. Escorted by Polish and Neapolitan cavalry, he thought it best not to enter Vilna but met its governor, Marat, outside the walls while Caulaincourt went in to buy warm clothing. The coaches and their escort then proceeded through Kovno to Gragau, where the emperor decided to exchange the carriage for a sleigh. Once Napoleon left, morale in the French army plummeted. There was indiscipline and desertion even among the guard. As if by some sort of pathetic fallacy, the day after his departure was the coldest day of all, with the temperature down to -36°F. Bonaparte's poor judgment of men was once again made manifest as command devolved on Murat, who began by inveighing against the emperor, telling Devout they both served a monster. Devout, who despised Murat, replied coldly that he was a monster to whom Murat owed everything. The death toll again began to rise. 20,000 men dropped away in the 3 days between Smorgoni and Vilna. In the extreme cold it was common for 400 men to cluster round a fire at night, and in the morning for 300 of them to be dead. Soldiers started setting entire houses on fire and standing round the flaming ruins all night. On the march to Vilna the food shortage was so acute that some men ate their own severed fingers and drank their own blood. But the greatest killer was gangrene, an inevitable consequence of men trying to warm frozen limbs at the fire. Since at these temperatures water froze a mere 3 feet from the fire, one could only get warm by getting burnt. Men became gangrenous simply because they had no sensation in their limbs and got too close to the heat. All who braved the horrors of that winter suffered frightfully, not just the French. Contrary to popular belief, the pursuing Russians were not well equipped against the winter. In recoiling in horror at the casualty list of the Grand Army, it is easy to forget that 0 Russians died in the snows in addition to battle casualties. Poland and friendly territory lay tantalizingly close, but still the army's ordeal was not over. The force that entered Vilna on the 8th of December in temperatures of Z6°F was no better than a rabble, as became clear by their actions on entering the town. Elaborate quartermastering arrangements had been laid down in a situation where there was enough meat and flour to feed 100,000 men for 40 days, but the incoming soldiery simply ran amok, looting and pillaging. In an initial riot at the city gates many men were crushed to death. Others drank themselves into a stupor on the plentiful brandy, collapsed drunkenly on the sidewalk and died of exposure in the frozen streets. No attempt was made to post pickets, with the black comedy result that pursuing Cossacks actually came galloping into town while drunken French troops gorged and caroused. The mere sight of a handful of Cossacks threw Murat into wholesale panic. Even though he had express orders from Napoleon to hold Vilna for at least 8 days and give his men adequate rest and recreation, Murat ordered a general evacuation just 24 hours after arrival. There were Z0000 wounded Allied troops from all theaters in the town's hospitals, but they were simply left to the barbarous mercies of the incoming Cossacks. When he heard of this shameful retreat before a handful of Russian irregulars, Napoleon became incandescent with rage. Only 10,000 men resumed the march with Murat on the 10th of December. As soon as they encountered the first steep hill, they abandoned all remaining carts, cannons and pay chests. With great reluctance they carried only the regimental eagles. At Kovno only 7,000 effectives were left, and at this town Ney had to turn and join with the rearguard, fighting for a day and a night before the Russians broke off, allowing the French to cross the Niemen. Ney was the last Frenchman to leave Russian soil, and, as he watched the Niemen bridges burning behind him, he at least had the satisfaction of reflecting that for him the 1812 campaign had been a personal triumph. The Russians began their invasion of Poland in January 1813. Murat pulled back to Posen, then fled to his kingdom of Naples, leaving the army in the more capable hands of Eugene de Beauharnais who, obeying his stepfather's orders, pulled his men back behind the Elbe. Once in Germany, the handful of survivors from Russia dispersed to the various fortress towns. MacDonald had already retreated into Poland and eventually brought a force of 7,000 back to Königsberg via Riga, and Tilsit. Schwarzenberger and Rainier took their corps into Austria. It was estimated that by New Year 1813 just 25,000 survivors from Central Army Group and 68,000 from the outlying corps had re-entered Germany. On leaving Gragau, Napoleon traveled in disguise and took with him in his sledge only Caulaincourt as company, and a small escort, for they were now in supposedly friendly territory. The temperature was Zoef, and Napoleon, whose penchant for hot baths and roaring fires was well known, complained of the cold. Caulaincourt remembered how their breath froze on the lips and how small icicles formed under the nose, on the eyebrows and round the eyelids. The emperor kept going over and over the details of the campaign he had just lost, wondering at what points he should have done things differently. Occasionally Caulaincourt would interrupt the litany of if-onlys to tell the emperor a few home truths about the unpopularity of the imperial regime, the high taxes, suppression of liberties, and general bitterness about nepotism and favoritism. Napoleon took the criticism well, smiled occasionally, and, when Caulaincourt expressed himself forcefully, tried to pinch his ear. Unable to find it under the snowcap, he tweaked his neck and cheek instead. On the 10th of December they reached Warsaw, where the emperor thought it safe enough to abandon his incognito. He summoned the French ambassador, the Abbé Prat, and treated him to another sermon on the Russian campaign. He ended by asking Prat sharply where were the I0 Polish cavalry he had been promised. Prat replied that there was no money, whereat Napoleon lost his temper and accused him of defeatism. According to Caulaincourt, he repeated obsessively the line about from the sublime to the ridiculous. Continuing the journey that evening, he and Caulaincourt arrived in Posen on the 12th of December. This was the first town which had secure communications with France, so Napoleon was able to read a stack of letters. The ones that pleased him most were from Marie-Louise, reporting the progress of their son. He beamed, read some extracts to Caulaincourt, and said, "Haven't I got a good wife?" The 1/3 of December, as he sped across northern Germany, saw Napoleon at his oddest. He discussed his career and personality with his companion as if they were talking dispassionately about a third party. Caulaincourt thought him a man who had lost touch with reality. He seemed unaware of the scale of his losses and full of self-delusion and unrealistic plans for the future. His mood swings were violent. One moment he would be complaining, rightly, that far too many people had taken advantage of him. Next moment he would be roaring with laughter at the conceit that the Prussians might ambush them and deliver them over to the British, to be exhibited in London in an iron cage. Those who hold that Napoleon was the great existentialist like to cite this sleigh ride, which shows the emperor unsurprised by anything, a man always ready for anything, however improbable, to happen. They proceeded by sledge through Saxony to Dresden, where they arrived at midnight on the 1/3. The King of Saxony met them at 3 a.m. and made available his comfortable coach, in which they departed at 7 a.m. on the 14th. Changing vehicles several times, they took another 3 days to reach Verdun, traveling via Leipzig, Auerstadt, Erfurt, Frankfurt, and Mainz. After a short stop at Meaux, they arrived in Paris at 7:45 on R8 December and drove straight to the Tuileries. Caulaincourt reported that he had not slept properly for 14 days and nights and could not re-establish his proper sleep pattern for another fortnight. Once back in Paris, Napoleon ordered a round of balls, fêtes and receptions, acting as if nothing much had happened during his absence. But 2 days before his arrival the 29th bulletin had been published in Le Moniteur. Even this heavily doctored version of the truth caused consternation among people grown used to the seeming inevitability of victory and the invincibility of the emperor. As the scale of the losses became clear, Napoleon's propagandist attempt to put a brave face on things and, by the sumptuous balls and luxurious dinners, to pretend it was business as usual seemed the crassest of insensitivity. It was fortunate indeed that General Mallet had not staged his coup a couple of months later. Napoleon now learned the details of what had happened on the night of 23 of October. Rate R2. Mallet, who had been involved in the Fouche-Talleyrand plot in R808-9 while the emperor was in Spain, began by releasing the anti-Bonapartist generals Lahéry, and Geidel and, together with his fellow plotters Boutru and Radau, announced that Napoleon was dead in Russia. The conspirators managed to arrest both the minister and prefect of police but fell foul of General Hulin, commander of the Paris garrison, who refused to join them. Without his support, the conspirators were sunk. They and their accomplices were rounded up, tried on the 28th of October with a rapidity that recalled the Dingian affair, and executed by firing squad on the 29th. Although the imperial police had betrayed extreme incompetence in allowing themselves to be arrested, the plot was not the serious threat to Bonaparte it might have been. This time neither Fouch nor Talleyrand were involved, nor, fortunately for the emperor, were the notables. The coup was an ad hoc pact between royalists and extreme republicans. The idea was that, with Napoleon out of the picture, a new assembly would decide later between a republic or a Bourbon restoration. Napoleon's response on his return was to make Marie-Louise regent against his likely future absences on campaign. 1812 was the beginning of the end for Napoleon. The miracle was that he was able to rally a reluctant French people at all after such a catastrophe. The total loss of human life on this campaign has been disputed and almost certainly underestimated. 370,000 French troops perished on the battlefield, of cold and exposure or disease. 200,000 more were taken prisoner or deserted, and, in the light of what has been said about partisan atrocities, there need be no serious debate about their probable fate. The frightful loss of life can be gauged from one single statistic. The Guard, 47,000 strong, had not been involved in the heaviest fighting, but returned with just 500 men alive. Additionally, the French lost 200,000 horses, a loss that could never be made good and was to have devastating military consequences. The Russians lost at least 150,000 dead in battle, plus a huge but unknown number of civilians. Given the propensity of historians seriously to underrate casualties in Russian warfare, it is not improbable that 1 million people died during the 6-month campaign of Raid R2. In retrospect, it seems that Napoleon made virtually every mistake in the book: failure to keep Sweden and Turkey in play as allies against Russia, failure to set out in May, to grant Polish independence, to free the serfs, to reach Moscow by early August if he was to go there at all. Then there were sins of commission: wasting time in Vilna, Vitebsk and Moscow, not sending in the Guard at Borodino, losing his nerve at Maloyaroslavets. But the worst mistake was the failure to think through logistical problems, admittedly almost insurmountable in an army of 600,000. Everything was underestimated: the speed at which armies could march, the amount of food that could be obtained en route, the poor state of the roads. The supply dumps at Danzig and Königsberg were too far behind the army, and the mud roads could not take the convoy traffic, while those at Minsk and Vitebsk were not well enough guarded, so that they fell into Russian hands. There was no absolute shortage of supplies, but no proper infrastructure to get them where they were needed. Additionally, by his gambler's ploy of doubling his bets each time the original wager failed, Napoleon ended up in Moscow when he had never considered this as a possibility in his original plans. If he was to invade Russia at all, a serious error while he was bogged down in Spain, he should have wintered in Smolensk. By marching so far into the heart of Russia, he proved the truth of Clausewitz's observation that to advance deep into enemy country is itself a kind of defeat. By the time of Borodino, the emperor had lost so many men that he lacked the resources for decisive victory. Apart from losses through disease and starvation, another factor was at play: the longer his lines of communication, the more troops he had to detach for secondary roles: the protection of depots, internal security, the garrisoning of cities captured, the provision of escorts for couriers and envoys. To spend a month in Moscow waiting for the Tsar to surrender made no sense. Why did Bonaparte not remember that French possession of Vienna had not weighed with the Austrians in 1805, nor the loss of Berlin with the Prussians in 1806? Napoleon's explanation of the disaster of 1812 was peculiarly disingenuous. He was right to be scornful of the Russian army, since Kutuzov's much-lauded strategy of trading space for time was a pure accident, not something he intended. Kutuzov has often been claimed as the man who defeated Napoleon, but in fact his military caliber, both at Borodino and during the French retreat, was not impressive. But Napoleon in his own apologia quickly moved from a warranted proposition to pure fantasy. He claimed that his total numbers were 400,000 and that only 160,000 went beyond Smolensk. Of this total of 400,000, half were German or Italian and only 140,000 members of the polyglot army spoke French. So, according to Bonaparte's numerical legerdemain, only S0000 Frenchmen were lost in 1812 and the Russians lost 4 times total Allied fatalities. This sort of cynicism gives powerful ammunition to those who claim that the emperor never really thought of anyone but himself. His further explanation for 1812 was also mendacious. He claimed that he beat the Russians at all points but was then overcome by General Winter. But Winter was only a major factor in the latter stages of the retreat, more especially after Berezina. The sober facts are that the French lost more men, through starvation, exhaustion, sickness, capture, desertion and death in battle, on the advance to Moscow than on the retreat. The Grand Army suffered more from the heat of July and August, and the initial stages of the Russian winter in 1812 were mild. It was, after all, because of the thaw that Napoleon faced the great crisis at the Berezina. But the self-serving myth propagated by the emperor, that he was defeated only by the weather, took hold, gained acceptance and is the received opinion today, surely the ultimate triumph for Bonapartist propaganda. It is a clue to Napoleon's personality that his explanation for disaster always hinges on fate. The excuses are all ifs. If Moscow had not been burnt, the Emperor Alexander would have been forced to make peace. If winter cold had not set in 15 days earlier than usual, if Murat had not abandoned Vilna, there is no suggestion that the emperor should have foreseen some of the obvious consequences of campaigning in Russia. He even absurdly claims that there was no reason to predict that the temperature might fall to 6 degrees below freezing in November. The objective nightmare suffered by 500,000 Allied troops in the frozen steppes was itself the product of a mind that had ceased to function effectively, and of an imagination that had gone into free fall.